My name is Joanna Langston. I'm 32. And last Tuesday, I signed away my inheritance while still wearing my U.S. Army dress blues. The courtroom was quiet. Not because anyone respected the moment, but because they thought they'd already won. My father sat across the table, fingers steepled like a CEO finalizing a hostile takeover. Beside him, his new wife, barely a decade older than me, offered me a rehearsed smile. And to their left, my brother Ben adjusted his Rolex and glanced at his phone, bored. The lawyer cleared his throat. "This document relinquishes your claim to the Langston estate," he said, sliding the paper toward me. My signature, they believed, was the last piece of their puzzle, and I gave it to them. No protest, no fight, no warning. I picked up the pen, pressed it against the page, and signed. They thought they'd buried me right there in that chair, but what they didn't know was that 7 years ago, in a military hospital 5,000 miles away, I'd already signed something else, something that would change everything. And that paper was still active, still binding, and legally superior to anything they'd forged today, but let them smirk. Let them believe the disappointment daughter just folded and walked away. They had no idea I was still a soldier, and that this was just the beginning of their last battle. My mother died in April. Peacefully, they said, in her sleep. In the old farmhouse outside of Asheville, the one she refused to sell, even after Dad left. I wasn't there. I was in Ramstein coordinating medevac logistics for a convoy ambushed outside of Mosul. The message came coded, standard protocol, no emotions, no ceremony, family emergency, death in immediate family. Request return clearance within 72 hours. That's how I found out the only person who had ever believed in me was gone. Mom and I weren't the kind to call every week, but she never missed a birthday, never forgot to ask how my deployments were going. And every care package she sent, from the mountains of North Carolina to whatever desert I was stuck in, always smelled like cinnamon and cedar. She was the reason I joined the Army in the first place. Not for war, but for order, for discipline, for something clean and honest. Dad never got that. He used to joke that I wore the uniform because you couldn't cut it in the real world. This from a man who left my mother for his dental hygienist and moved into a house with marble sinks and no soul. Her name was Cheryl. She had perfect teeth, perfect highlights, and a voice that said sweetheart, like she was preparing to stab you with a salad fork. They got married 6 months after the divorce was finalized. My brother Ben was best man. I wasn't invited. And now they'd summoned me, as next of kin, to what they called a simple family meeting. A neutral lawyer's office, mahogany table, water in crystal glasses, the kind of setting where civility looks like poison dressed in pearls. They told me Mom didn't leave a formal will, that her assets were merged into the Langston estate, that it was only fair to divide things sensibly now that she was gone. And by sensibly, they meant Ben gets the property, Cheryl gets the jewelry, Dad keeps the stocks, and I, the daughter who wasn't around enough, should understand the optics and just step aside. "Not everything has to be a fight, Joanna," Cheryl said as she pushed the paperwork toward me. "This isn't personal, it's just practical. Practical, like erasing a dead woman's wishes. Like pretending I didn't pay off the reverse mortgage on that farmhouse. Like forgetting the only reason it wasn't sold years ago was because I secretly wired money every month to keep the taxes covered. They didn't know because Mom never told them. She de-promised. This stays between us, Joe. I need to keep the house in my name, but I trust you." And I kept that promise, even now, which made this whole charade almost laughable. But I didn't laugh, I nodded, picked up the pen, and signed what they asked for, because I already knew something they didn't. The house was never theirs to begin with. They've never understood silence. To them, silence meant surrender. To me, it was strategy. I learned that the hard way, growing up in the Langston household. In that family, noise got you noticed. Ben had a natural gift for it, the golden boy, honor roll, lacrosse team captain, legacy admit to Harvard Law. He spoke in full paragraphs by age 4, and they never stopped applauding. I, on the other hand, preferred quiet. I read manuals instead of magazines, fixed broken radios in the garage, memorized military ranks by the time I was 10. Mom noticed. Dad didn't. To him, I was the weird one. The stubborn one. The one who always had something to prove. When I enlisted at 19, without telling anyone, he told the neighbors I was having a gap year meltdown. Ben texted me, I guess some people peek in camo. At family dinners, the rare ones I was home for, they'd ask how long until I was done playing soldier. The army, in their eyes, was what people did when college didn't work out. What girls did when they didn't want to get married. What failures did when they didn't have real ambition. They had no idea what I was doing behind those bases and barbed wire fences. And I didn't tell them, because it wouldn't have mattered. They didn't know I'd completed airborne school twice, that I'd coordinated medical supply lines through war zones with 18-hour shifts, that I'd been promoted faster than anyone else in my unit, or that, last year, I'd been assigned to a military legal team, overseeing contract compliance between the Department of Defense and private contractors. I wore 2 ranks, one on my shoulder and one in my silence. Let them think I was just a glorified driver. It made things easier. So when Dad said, "You weren't around for your mother's final months," I didn't remind him that I had secured a humanitarian corridor for refugees 300 miles away. When Cheryl said, "You didn't stay involved in the family," I didn't mention that I had quietly sent money for Mom's property taxes for 6 years straight. When Ben joked, "Joe's just here to make sure we don't take her camo boots," I didn't reply, because silence, when used right, is more powerful than any speech, and they were about to learn what I'd built in that silence. But not yet. Let them keep talking. Let them forget what happens when the quiet one takes the oath to protect and remembers everything. The folder was navy blue, heavy stock paper, embossed with the gold initials of Langston and Bell, Dad's legal team for over a decade. Ben slid it across the table like a card shark revealing the final hand. "It's just a formality," he said, his voice syrupy with false concern. "No one's trying to cut you out, Joe. It's just that. Mom didn't really specify anything clearly. And since Dad's the executor..." "I understand," I said calmly, not even glancing at the folder. Cheryl leaned forward, a gentle touch on my wrist, perfume like powder and vinegar. "We just want closure," she said softly. "You've been gone a long time. It's not about money, it's about peace, family peace." Funny, they talked about peace like it was something you printed on stationery and slid across a table. I'd seen real peace, the kind you pay for in years, the kind you carry home in a flag-draped casket, but I nodded anyway. Let them think I was being soothed. The lawyer cleared his throat again, 3rd time in 10 minutes. "This document is a voluntary relinquishment," he explained. "By signing, you formally remove yourself from any claims related to the estate or the primary property." The pen was already waiting. Ben had placed it on top of the folder like a sword over a surrender treaty. I picked it up. Read the first line slowly, as if I needed time. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I'd written contracts like this myself, in war zones, under duress, for corporations 10 times more cunning than the people in this room. The clause they missed was a simple line in Latin. Voluntas ultima non revocatur nisi per scripturam subsequentum testamenti. Final will is not superseded unless explicitly revoked by a subsequent legal testament. I almost smiled. Almost, I signed. Date, initials. Signature, no tremble. No pause. Ben exhaled, loud and smug. Dad nodded approvingly. Cheryl smiled like she'd just won Miss Congeniality at a funeral. "That's very mature of you, Joanna," Dad said, folding the folder with a satisfying snap. "I'm proud of you." First time he'd said those words to me since I was 13, I almost said thank you, but instead I stood, straightened my posture, smoothed the edge of my jacket, then quietly replied, "I'm glad this is on record." And left, because sometimes the best legal move is letting the other side file the wrong paperwork first. I stepped out of Langston and Bell just as the late afternoon sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. That's when I saw him, leaning against a black SUV, arms crossed, uniform pressed so sharp it could cut glass. No smile, just steady eyes that met mine like they'd been waiting all day. Eli Beckett, Major, Army Logistics. The kind of man who could make chaos run on time. The kind of man who never asked for your battle report because he already knew where the scars were. "Joe," he said, voice low and warm. "Heard you had to sit through a meeting with the wolves today." I let out a breath that might have been a laugh. He didn't press, didn't ask questions, didn't say, "I'm sorry," like the others always did, as if pity was a substitute for presence. That was the thing about Eli. He never tried to fix me. He just showed up, again and again. Like silence was sacred and being seen was enough. "You okay?" he asked after a long pause. I nodded, adjusting the cuff of my jacket. "I'm fine, just trying not to laugh." "Why?" I looked ahead, jaw firm. "Because they think they won," I said. "They have no idea I signed something else. Years ago. Something they can't touch." Eli's mouth curved just slightly, not a smile, but recognition. He opened the passenger door. Didn't say, "Get in." Didn't say, "You need rest." Just opened it, like he knew. I didn't need saving. I just needed a place to breathe. "You don't have to carry it alone, you know," he said, finally. I met his eyes. "I'm not carrying it, Eli. I'm positioning it." I slid into the seat, steady and quiet. "They didn't break me today. They positioned me for checkmate." He nodded once. "Then let's be there when it lands." Fade out as SUV pulls away. She doesn't look back. He doesn't look away. The war hasn't ended, but for the first time, someone stands beside her, not in front. They scheduled the will reading like it was a celebration. Leather chairs, bottled water, a cheese plate. Dad wore his navy blazer, like he was heading to a country club brunch. Cheryl was in pastel, grief rebranded as elegance. Ben scrolled through emails on his phone like he was too important to be bothered, but still curious enough to show up. I sat at the far end of the table, back straight, hands folded, eyes quiet, and behind me, standing in the far corner like a shadow in uniform, was Eli. He said nothing. No salute, no smile, just presence, steady as a mountain. The lawyer cleared his throat, that same weak little tick from our first meeting. "We're here today to execute what we believe to be the final instructions of Mrs. Evelyn Langston," he began. Cheryl leaned forward slightly, expectant. Dad nodded. Ben looked up almost smug. The lawyer continued. "However," that word cut through the room like cold steel. "There has been a legal development." Everyone stilled. The cheese plate was suddenly irrelevant. The lawyer set a second folder on the table. This one older. Worn, stamped with a federal seal. He adjusted his glasses. "This document was executed 7 years ago at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. Signed in the presence of 2 military officers and a Department of Defense notary. Under Title 10, Section 1044B of the United States Code, it holds legal authority that supersedes any state-level filings made after it, unless specifically revoked." He looked up directly at my father. There was no revocation. Cheryl blinked. Ben frowned. Dad leaned forward. "What exactly are you saying?" The lawyer didn't flinch. "I'm saying this." He tapped the newer papers, the ones Ben had celebrated over, "is legally void." Cheryl's mouth opened, then closed. Ben looked like someone had unplugged his brain mid-sentence. And then the lawyer asked the question. Quietly, clearly, precisely. "Is Captain Joanna Langston present in the room?" I stood, buttoned my jacket, tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, and stepped forward. Not as the forgotten daughter, not as the disappointment, but as the sole legal executor of the only valid will that ever mattered. The silence was total. You could hear the air leave the room like it had been punched in the chest. Dad looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. Cheryl dropped her napkin. Ben muttered, "This is ridiculous." But no one spoke above me. Not now. Not ever again, the lawyer continued. Per Mrs. Langston's federal testament, the Asheville farmhouse, all its land, its contents, and all her liquid assets, including the investments she controlled jointly through her private trust, are to be transferred in full to Captain Joanna Langston. He paused, effective immediately. I didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't blink, Because this wasn't a victory lap. This was justice. Delayed, but never denied. From the back of the room, Eli shifted slightly, just enough to let me know he was still there. Watching, witnessing, guarding my silence like it was sacred. And it was. Dad's jaw clenched, not like a man who's surprised, like a man who's been caught and is trying to decide whether denial or domination will save him faster. Cheryl's hand went to her pearl necklace like it might choke her. Ben was the first to speak, or rather scoff. "Are we really doing this?" he said, half laughing, arms flung out like I'd told everyone the earth was flat. "This is absurd. She wasn't even around. She barely talked to Mom. And now she gets everything because she dug up some dusty army form." I turned slowly. Not angry, not smug, just steady. "Ben," I said, "that dusty army form was signed in a federal medical facility, witnessed under oath, and filed with 2 branches of government. Which is 2 more than your little scheme had." I didn't raise my voice, because I didn't need to. Truth doesn't shout when it's been waiting this long. Dad finally stood, not quickly, not boldly. More like a man whose legs were deciding whether to hold him up or let him fall. "You blindsided us, Joe," he said. "You let us sit there, thinking you agreed. You signed the waiver." I tilted my head. "You mean the waiver you had drafted without legal backup? The one you rushed through because you assumed I'd still follow orders?" He said nothing, so I continued. "You gambled on me being the obedient daughter. But I stopped being that when you stopped being a father." For a second, just a flicker, I saw it in his eyes. Not guilt, not shame, recognition. He saw me, fully, finally, but it was too late. The lawyer closed the folder with a soft click. "Unless there are legal objections backed by federal authority," he said carefully, "this matter is considered closed." Ben opened his mouth again, then looked at Dad, then at Cheryl, and said nothing. Even he knew when a war was over. I gathered the original document, folded it precisely, slipped it into my briefcase. The room sat like a deflated parade float, bright intentions collapsed under the weight of truth. And behind me, Eli stepped forward. Not to gloat, not to intimidate, just to stand beside me. That's when Dad asked, in a voice that didn't sound like his, "Why didn't you tell us?" I paused at the door. Because that was the question he should have asked years ago. "Because you never asked," I said. "And because you never thought I mattered, unless I was proving something to you." I looked over my shoulder, one last time. "And now that I don't have to prove anything to anyone, you finally notice what I built." Then I turned and walked out. The lock turned stiff in my hand. Like the door had been waiting years for me to return, but wasn't sure I still belonged. The hinges creaked. Same sound they made when I used to sneak out at 16. Different reason now. I stepped inside the farmhouse, and it smelled exactly like I remembered. Cedarwood, black coffee, and the faintest trace of lavender oil Mom used to rub into her temples when the world became too loud. I didn't say anything. Didn't whisper, "I'm home." Didn't pretend it was still warm with her presence. It was hollow. But it was mine. I moved through the rooms like a ghost retracing its own life. The kitchen still had the mug with my name on it, chipped, but clean. The window above the sink still had that crack from when I threw a baseball too hard. There were no family portraits left, no reminders of birthdays or graduations. Dad had cleared those out, I'm sure. "Too cluttered," he used to say, but the memories were embedded in the floorboards. And she had left something behind, something he didn't find. It took me less than 10 minutes to reach the fireplace. Third brick from the right, loose in the corner. Exactly where she said it would be. I slid it out with a shaking hand. Inside was a small envelope. Faded, soft from time. My name written in cursive, Joe. My breath caught in my throat not because of the letter, but because she believed I would come back for it, even after everything. Even after the silence, even after they rewrote the story of who I was supposed to be, she never stopped trusting me. I sat on the kitchen floor and opened the envelope with 2 fingers, careful not to rip anything. Her handwriting hadn't changed. It still curled like treble clefs in the margins, but the words, they hit like thunder in the ribcage. "Joe, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But you already knew that. What they'll say now that you were absent, that you didn't care, is a lie wrapped in fear. You were always the one who left quietly, so others could speak loudly and still feel important. I watched you give up birthdays, holidays, comfort, love, so you could protect a world that wouldn't thank you. I saw it, every time. You showed up, even when no one else clapped. They always expected you to apologize for being too much or too little, depending on their mood. But I never needed you to be anything but yourself. That's why the house is yours. The land, the trees, the quiet, because only someone who knows the value of stillness knows how to protect it. Do whatever you want with it. Turn it into a shelter, a fortress, a garden. Or burn it all down and start over. Just promise me one thing. Never make yourself small for people who can't handle your fullness. With all my love. Mom. I didn't cry, I didn't crumble. I just pressed the letter against my chest and sat there on the cold floor as the morning sun crept through the old lace curtains and touched my face like she used to when I couldn't sleep. I understood it now. Why she never told Dad. Why she filed the original will in Germany. Why she chose me, the quiet one, the distant one, the wrong daughter in everyone else's eyes. Because when everything else fell apart, I was the only one who didn't. Outside, I heard Eli's voice, soft, calm, thanking the locksmith. The sound grounded me, reminded me I wasn't alone, even when it felt like I'd spent my whole life living that way. I stood, folded the letter with military precision, slipped it into the steel box next to the deed, and locked it, not for secrecy, for safekeeping, because legacy isn't about land or money, it's about what's left when people try to erase you and fail. I stepped outside. Eli was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, eyes searching mine. Ready? He asked. I nodded. I'm more than ready, I'm finally home. We didn't have a party. No grand reopening of the house. No ribbon cutting. No social media post-tagged comeback story. Just a dinner. One table, 2 plates, and a chair we didn't fill. The sun had barely set when Eli lit the fireplace. The same hearth where my mother used to warm her hands every Christmas Eve. I cooked. Nothing fancy, just her cornbread recipe, and the kind of stew she'd say was simple but steady. The way she liked everything. Eli set the table in silence. No need for music. The crackling wood was enough. And then we sat across from each other. Like we had in mess halls, in deployment tents, in steel containers under missile-laced skies. Except this time there was peace. No alarms, no orders, just space and breath and truth. I raised my glass, just water. Simple, steady. For the women who weren't soft enough to be loved easily, I said quietly, but strong enough to be remembered forever. Eli clinked his glass against mine, didn't say anything, but his eyes held all the words the world never said to women like my mother, or like me. The third chair at the table stayed empty. I didn't fill it. Didn't drape it in flowers. Didn't light a candle, because some people don't need reminders. They built the whole room. After we ate, Eli went out to the porch, taking his usual stance, back straight, hands behind him, watching the dark hills like they still needed guarding. I stayed inside. I sat at the kitchen table with the box beside me, the letter, the deed, the silence. And then the doorbell rang, just once. No follow-up knock, no footsteps walking away. I opened the door. It was Ben, no entourage. No smug grin, no legal threats, just my brother, small in his own skin, for the first time in his life. I didn't know, he said, voice dry. I thought she just didn't care. I looked at him, at the man who once laughed when I left for basic training, at the boy who always got what he wanted and never once wondered if someone else paid the cost. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger, I felt history. And a strange kind of mercy. She cared, I said softly, enough to choose who could hold what she loved, even when it was you. Ben's shoulders dropped, he didn't argue, just nodded. And then he looked past me, into the house he used to run through in muddy cleats, at the table where Mom used to pour his cereal. I just wanted to see it again, he said. I stepped aside, let him look. But I didn't invite him in, because forgiveness is a threshold, not a doormat. As he turned to leave, I said one final thing. You never asked what I was doing, but I kept showing up anyway. That was the difference. And I closed the door. Back inside, Eli was still near the window. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't need to. He just poured 2 more glasses of water, set them on the table, and nodded toward the empty chair. "Leave it," I said, sitting down again. "Some legacies don't need to be filled. They just need to be honored." 3 weeks later, the phone rang. Not the cell. The landline, the one Mom refused to get rid of, even when it stopped being fashionable. "Real conversations happen on real wires," she used to say. It rang once, then twice, and then I picked it up. "Captain Langston?" A voice asked, crisp, polite, unfamiliar. I almost corrected them. I wasn't in uniform. I wasn't on base, but I let it sit for a second. "Yes," I said finally. "This is the Office of Veteran Affairs. We just wanted to confirm that your request to donate the Langston farmland to the Women's Recovery Project has been approved." I smiled, the first real one in a long time. "Thank you," I said. "Make sure the gardens stay open." She loved her lavender. That night, I walked the edge of the property. Just me, the trees, and the faint smell of rain on dirt. In my left hand, I carried the folded flag from Mom's military burial. A request she made quietly, though she'd never served. Because I served her, I'd told the clerk at the base office when she passed. She earned this through me. They didn't argue, they just nodded. I passed the tree swing she'd made me when I was 7. The well cover where Ben once dared me to drink from like pioneers. The bench Dad built and never sat on. And then I kept walking. Past it all, not away from it, but beyond it. At the top of the hill, Eli waited beside the car. He didn't open the door, didn't rush me. He just stood there, eyes on the horizon. Like someone who'd finally realized some battles aren't won with bullets, but with becoming someone no one can take apart again. As I approached, he asked one thing: "You okay leaving it all behind?" I looked back at the house one last time, the porch light still on, the kitchen window catching the last of the sun. And then I said, "I'm not leaving it, I'm finishing it." We got in the car, drove quietly down the dirt road. No music, no GPS, just 2 soldiers finally going somewhere not to fight but to live. At the main road, we passed the church. The parking lot was full. A sign read, "Tonight, Langston Community Dedication Ceremony, honoring Evelyn and Joanna Langston." I didn't stop. Didn't need the applause. Didn't need the recognition. Because when the world finally learns your name, you don't have to repeat it. As the hills disappeared behind us, I pulled down the sun visor. A photo fluttered out. Me and Mom, years ago, covered in flour, laughing in the kitchen. I slid it into the glove box. Some legacies you carry forward. Others, you walk away from without looking back.